Comrades, I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity of a full discussion of the background and the current issues which are on our headlines and are bursting into our attention, all the time, because we're seeing devastation after devastation in our eyes, and even the shooting of people who waving white flags, and then it turns out that that's friendly fire. Such devastation, humiliation all around, complete catastrophe of military strategies on both sides, if I could say. At the same time, we see something approaching genocide. In fact, a complete elimination of a whole section of a people, the Palestinian people, and everywhere are crying out for a ceasefire, which would mean, in a sense, an acceptance of a kind of a stalemate, from one side, and a political stalemate which has lasted for the past 50 or more years, in which there'd been no resolution at all of the national question, of the question of peace and peaceful collaboration in the area which is called Palestine. And at the same time, we have mobilization of the labor movement, which is, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but which is at a high level. And from east to west, and in the United States and also internationally, we see the labor movement coming into action again after the economic issues and the wage claims and battles and strikes. And in a way, we're seeing a progress in terms of the political consciousness of workers and the dislocation of the working class, from the collaborating parties, which are justifying, the devastation which is taking place to tens of thousands of people, death without measure, in Palestine. I've just heard on the BBC an interview with a military specialist who was talking about the extensive use of 2,000-pound bombs on an unprecedented scale on a minuscule area, with, of course, the devastation, he says, which it would actually lead to liquefaction of the soil and of the earth around that, and the killing of people everyone within about 50 meters, of that bomb. And that's being, there are tens of thousands, bombing without precedent taking place, which is an outrage to all humanity, to us watching and acting on behalf, trying to bring about the ceasefire, trying to bring about the logic of Marxism and of socialist future, to people who are absolutely in despair and anger and in genocidal rage. And I'm pleased that we could have Finbar, to speak. Finn is, as you see, a working class leader in Ireland, who's been working on the issues of resolving the national question in Ireland, for many a decade, and kept the banner of Labour, clean and drawing many to the cause of socialism, rather than to the excesses of nationalism. Finn, I'll give you something like 25 minutes to lead, unless you want less. And then, as before, we'll have contributions. Please indicate, and we'll have a full discussion. Finn, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Comrade. Well, David has given a very good summary of the context in which this discussion is taking place. And while the primary focus of our discussion is Gaza and the war in Gaza, there's a far wider discussion we're going to engage in as well about the role, particularly the role that the imperialist powers have played and the way in which they use religion and religious divisions in societies to advance their own case. The war itself has led, as we know, to over 18,000 deaths, 50,000 perhaps injured, and almost 2 million people displaced in the small enclave of Gaza. And there's a danger of escalation. the involvement of Iran and the Hezbollah and the Yemeni opposition shelling Israeli shipping in the Red Sea. So there's all kinds of dangers. We'd also have to look at the role of imperialism in all of this. Israel is an investment hub for the US in high-tech military spending and development. It's also, of course, the US outpost in this oil-rich region. The Middle East today is a consequence of the dividing up of the region by the imperial powers, particularly at that time after World War I, particularly then France and Britain, but more recently, in recent decades, the direct and immediate involvement of the United States, of Russia, and of China. And these imperialist forces at various times foment division amongst the population, divisions on the basis of nationality, of religion, of ethnic background, and so on. So the only solution to these questions can be seen on a world scale. No single country can take on imperialism and defeat it. It has to be an international struggle of class, the working class, against the imperialist and capitalist forces. There has to be unity of workers across the various countries. It has to be unity in the immediate sense amongst Arab peoples, instead of having the various Arab countries, insofar as they're ruled by monarchs, regents of various kinds, autocrats, and dictators. And the initial kind of starting point for this crisis was, of course, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. How countries such as Egypt and Tunisia and the Ottoman government itself running into debt to European banks, and then the French occupying Tunisia, and they'd occupied Algeria since 1830. The Sykes-Picot Pact following World War I allowed for independent states in Iraq, Mesopotamia, Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria, as separate states, but, and this is significant, no state for Palestine. So Britain was given a mandate over the area until such time as the issue could be resolved. That was after World War I. Here we are in 2023. Not only is that situation not resolved, it's worse than it ever was. For the more general way in which powers use religion and use issues of that nature to further their interests, I'll take an early example, which is Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia. The Saud family named the country after themselves. It's called Saudi Arabia, after the Ibn Saud. He was a tribal leader, and his main influence was in an oasis in the Arabian Peninsula. And then he was favorable to Britain, so he became Sir. They made him a Sir. Well, mind you, when I say him, sorry, the original Ibn Saud, his ancestors continued on with the privileges that the Saudi family took to themselves as tribal leaders. But in 1915, Ibn Saud was made Sir. In 1935, he was given the Order of the Bath. It's just ridiculous the way they treat the people, patronizing in one sense and also giving them extra privileges. He even became a commander of the Indian Empire under the rule of under the decision of the British monarch. Now, what's interesting about this is, and this is significant in the territory overall, is that Ibn Saud made an alliance with the Wahhabi religious sect of Islam. Now, Wahhab was a person that lived in the 18th century, an extreme, fundamental kind of Islamic thinker, believing in the truth, the absolute truth of the Quran. But Saud made a deal with him, and the deal was that Wahhab would have the freedom, Saud would have the freedom to run and rule the peninsula. In return, Wahhab and the Wahhabis, as they came to be called, would have the sole proselytizing influence in the country. They'd be allowed to operate freely in the religious sphere, and Saud would control the country. In more recent times, the US got involved. So the US, by agreement, has got access to the oil profits. They allow the Wahhabis to have control over the religious aspect, and the Saud family to rule the country. So that alliance continues on, even though it started way back in the 18th century. with Saud and Wahib. Now, these characteristics of religion are not unique to the Middle East. There's a danger in some of the media commentary that this thing is seen as some kind of characteristic of people that live in these Middle Eastern countries. It's all over. I mean, Modi in India uses religion as a way of dividing the population there. India is a very good example to pick because in the 1930s, when the Muslim League was operating, they put forward a proposal in 1930 that the 4 northern provinces could consider separating from India and forming a different country. That was during the time of the struggle for independence from Britain by India, and Britain cashed in on that division, developed and fostered and patronized the Muslim League as a way of dividing the independence struggle. Now, there's comrades here who know far more about this than me, but nonetheless, the point is of a general nature where one power uses religion to achieve gains at the expense of others. But it's not one-sided. The same thing was true in the growth of the Arab empires, of the Muslim empires. There were 3 big Muslim empires, obviously the Ottoman, then there was the Mughal Empire in India, and the Safavid Empire in Persia, Iran. And they also used religious division to further their interest. In their case, they could exploit a division in Islam between, I'll explain a bit more about this later, between the Sunni and the Shiite peoples of Islam. When Muhammad died in 632, he didn't leave any named successor, so there was a quarrel about that. Now, that's where the Sunni Shia division came. The immediate successor to Muhammad was a guy called Abu Bakr, who was a military leader. He was followed by Umar. Bakr expanded the empire into across the countries of the Middle East, into Egypt and places like that. His follower Umar brought the empire across to the east into India and places like that, and his follower Uthman was principally involved in making the Quran accessible. But the person who claimed the proper succession was Ali, a man called Ali, who was the nephew of Muhammad. And then a split developed between those who wanted the leader to be selected from amongst the Quraysh tribe, which Muhammad belonged to, and those who felt that the inheritance should go to his relatives and pass down the line. And that split became the Sunni Shiite split. But it wasn't of a huge consequence. They were all military leaders, and success in Islam was military success. But this Sunni Shia split didn't have any significance at that time at all. It was used later, as I mentioned in a while, by the emperors in Persia and other places to further their interests, and it only widened and became significant around the 16th century. And it wasn't doctrinal. It wasn't just a discussion about whether Ali should be the successor or whether his successor should be selected. The Sunni Shiite divide was not just a doctrinal matter. It was exploited by the Arab empires just as much as the European empires exploited religion in other places. The Mongol invasions weakened the empires of the Muslim empires, and because success was measured in to the extent of military accomplishments, that was devastating, this invasion by the Mongols. But the story about Persia, which you mentioned earlier on, the Persian Empire was in conflict with the Ottomans, and they consciously fostered a different interpretation of Islam around the issue of Ali being the successor. So they elevated, Ali was killed, he was murdered by his opponents, and his son Hussein was also murdered along with, I think it was 32 followers. They were massacred by the Umayyad dynasty in Karbala in Iraq, and that's why it is a sacred city. But the Persian Empire in the early 16th century elevated that story of Ali and the murder of Hussein into a national story, so that became part of the identity of the empire in Persia. So they exploited and used this religious division between the succession to be allies or to be amongst his tribe. So that then became part of empire building. Now, if I might refer again, this isn't something that's peculiar to, as I said earlier, to the Middle East. It's not as if they're all eccentrics, religious fanatics over there. In fact, the three principal religions all began in Arab countries anyway. So it's not a particularly Islamic feature, but nonetheless, if you think of Putin, how he uses the Orthodox Church to bolster his support. In Ireland, the Orange Order was created and built back in the 18th century as a way of undermining the Republican struggle. And Israel uses religion all the time to bolster and strengthen its regime, using biblical references as justification for the seizure of the lands of Palestine. In fact, I heard one of the ministers of the Israeli government on telly recently saying there are no occupied territories because you don't occupy your own land. This land belongs to Israel, so we're not occupying it. It's ours. Which you can imagine the horrors that that kind of statement represents to the people of Palestine, who've been waiting since World War I for an independent state. So here we have Israel also using religion to further their development. But what's interesting, and also in terms of Israel, is the Israeli government supported Hamas when it was first formed, because their main enemy back in the at that time, after the Intifada, was the PLO and the campaign for a two-state solution. So they thought that by assisting Hamas, that will weaken and divide the opposition. So here you have the Israeli government developing and fostering a relationship with Islamic jihadists purely to achieve their own objectives as a state. We even see it in America. You have Trump, who presumably, I don't know anybody's religion, but I doubt if he has any religious affiliation of any kind, but he exploits Christian religions to gain his votes. And the evangelical Christians, who are all enthusiastic Trump supporters, they have an ideology which attaches them to this notion that when the Jews return to their land in Israel, this will further what they describe as the end of days. It'll encourage the end of the world, which they're enthusiastic about because they'll look straight to their reward. But a more recent example of the use of religion is Iraq. When America came into Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, Iraq was dominated by Sunni, the Sunni religious group. And when the US invaded back in 1993, I forget the year or not, but anyway, but when they invaded, the Shiite section of Islam, group in Islam, became the majority, and they then turned on the Sunni group. So America used the Shiite population as a battering ram against Hussein, and as a consequence of that, the ISIS and groups of that nature emerged from that conflict. The huge division that now exists in Iraq is a direct consequence of America using religious divisions, which have origins way back in the 7th century, using these religious divisions to develop and foster their own interests. In Afghanistan, Kermits are familiar with the use of religion there. Zia was elected back in 1977, and he was a very Islamic, very right-wing dictator in Pakistan, with the ambition of developing Islamic groups in the area. Russia then invaded the neighboring country of Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen, the Muslim group who declared a jihad, was supported. The Mujahideen was supported by Pakistan, by the Pakistani Secret Service, by the United States, by many, many countries, principally Pakistan and the United States, but other countries also became involved, including Britain. So the United States supported the fundamentalist Mujahideen group just to defeat the Russians. They supported Mullah Omar, his jihadist group. People flocked to Pakistan and to Afghanistan from other Muslim countries. And one of the people who came was Osama bin Laden, a privileged member of the Saudi entourage. He joined the Muslim Brotherhood, which I'll come back to later on, went off to Pakistan, and he became the Pakistan's bagman in Afghanistan, basically. But the group that the United States fostered at that time were responsible later for the explosion in the 5 bombs went off in the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and other places. Now, the rise of Islam as an anti-imperialist kind of group, to call it, I mean, I don't want to attribute qualities to it he doesn't have, but the rise of Islam as a way of struggling against imperial forces and occupying forces represents the absence of a true left-wing and socialist international organization that can take on issues of that nature. There should be an international of socialists and campaigning groups in order to defeat imperialism, but the way has been left open for Islam to be used and fostered as some kind of anti-imperialist force in these countries where they're experiencing the horrors of imperialism and its consequences. Another example in that regard is Algeria. Now, the Algerian people conducted a gallant struggle from 1954 to 1962, led by the FLN, that drove the French out. And the successors of the FLN, the most recent one, his name, Chadli, Colonel Chadli was his name, one of the successors of the FLN. He then, in 1988, his government at that time, introduced cuts in government spending, lifted price controls, privatized state companies, which then went to the army tops and to the state tops. Housing conditions deteriorated, unemployment deteriorated. Actually, David will recognize this experience in the ANC, where a revolutionary movement initially ends up in the hands of the bagmen who take all the good things for themselves, including state industries. That all happened in Algeria. But one of the things that happened in Algeria, which complicates matters, is the rise of an Islamic group who were called the FIS, the Front Islamique de Salut. That group then began to achieve electoral victories around 1991, 92, initially with municipal elections, and then in the parliamentary elections of 1991, the FIS group, the Islamic group, won almost 80% of the seats in parliament. The government at that time, that's the government of Chadli, didn't accept the result. They didn't allow the victors in the election to take power in the state, and that's the situation that still exists. So the Islamic groups emerged as, and the creation of a police state and the lack of democracy, it emerged because of the failure of the left groups to advance. In fact, there was a big demonstration in Algiers in 1992 with 300,000 people. And the demand of that was a group called the FFS. The demand was neither a police state nor an Islamic state, but for democracy. That was the demand. Nonetheless, the Islamic group managed to win the votes, and then the state forces refused to accept that victory. So here's another example of the absence of an international socialist organization that can lead such movements. Now, I want to spend a bit of time on this organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a very, very dangerous and very right-wing organization that extends into a number of countries. It was founded in 1928 by a teacher called Al-Banna as a conservative force, as a conservative influence against the rise of socialism, secularism, communism, and left-wing processes generally. And the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Banna in particular, advocated this notion that Islam has all the answers. So we don't need secularism, we don't need socialism, or anything of that nature, or nationalism. Islam has all the answers. He went back again, just like I was saying about Wahhabi and the Ibn Saud family, to this group, the Muslim Brotherhood, had the same perspective of just saying Islam contains the answers to these questions that people face in their everyday lives. But of course, one of the worst aspects of that is they're fiercely anti-Shia. The Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni group, and their main enemy is seen as Shia. But they see the Islamic system as being able to solve the problems of all humanity. Now, what's interesting here is that the Hamas group in Palestine is the Palestine branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was the Islamic Jihad, which is an allied group, that shot Anwar Sadat in Egypt. So Hamas is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the decisions about Hamas are made by what is called a shura, that the leadership are in Damascus making decisions for the group on the ground. But Hamas is not just an arbitrary, isolated group. They're part of an international movement led and developed by the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, it's based on a fundamentalist understanding of Islam and that is spreading across the globe. And it's not just, I mean, Muslim Brotherhood belongs to the Sunni side of the equation in terms of Islam, but it's also happening in the Shia. I mean, Wahhab, when I mentioned earlier, the Wahhabis, I mean, they're Sunnis, and the Saudi Arabia is on the Sunni side. I didn't intend that phrase, but they're on the Sunni part of the argument, whereas countries like Iran are on the Shia side of the argument, and also in Iraq. They have a lot of influence in Iraq and part of the Eastern Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. India, which is a huge Muslim empire at one point, was very influenced by the ideas of the Wahhabis. So this kind of revivalism extended across Sunni Islam, and it also extended across Shia Islam. So Islamism, and you could say that Al-Banna, the Muslim Brotherhood, was the father of Islamism in a way. But Islamism wasn't confined to Sunni. It extended to the Shia countries as well. Now, with regard to Hamas itself as an organization, I was looking at some results recently of a survey that was carried out by a Palestinian strategy and research organization, and they found some interesting figures. There's a bigger support for Hamas in the West Bank than there is in Gaza. The figures that they came up with, it was 52% of Gazans are pro-Hamas. And by the way, 52% is small, given all that's been happening there. 52% is what this group came up with. And they found that 85% in the West Bank would support Hamas. Now, and at 72% overall of Palestinians. Now, there is an argument that the support for Hamas is growing as a consequence of their participation in a military war against Israel. But nonetheless, 52% isn't huge of support in Gaza for that. And there will be splits in Hamas. It's not going to survive this. I also saw in this research that the group carried out is that the Sunni Islamic support for Hamas is falling, even significantly falling, even though Hamas is a Sunni group. And that's because the big Arab regimes, the rich Arab regimes, are Sunni. And even though Hamas is a Sunni group, it's growing amongst Shia supporters because they seem to be resisting. But nonetheless, 54% isn't huge. And that came out in a survey by Palestinians. But another aspect of it is that 90% of those questioned in the survey want Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the Palestinian Authority, to dissolve the Palestinian Authority because it's hated by the people in Palestine. Now, the slaughter, and that's the only word for it, that was conducted by Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Israel on October the 7th is being used as a justification by Israel for the continuing, as David alluded to earlier, genocide of people who live in Gaza, Palestinians, really. And that example of the 3 political prisoners who seem, according to reports, to be surrendering, were shot. And that seems to be the policy of Israel. Just shoot anybody that you think is a member of Hamas or you think is involved in the struggle, and just shoot them there and then. Now, that's a crime. If somebody is surrendering, people have to, it's accepted that you recognize that, and the person becomes a prisoner of war. But the policy of Israel is to shoot. And that's a justification Israel uses following on what can only be described as a slaughter that was conducted by Hamas. That method of shooting.
Sorry, if you could start drawing together the conclusion, and obviously you have a chance to come back again.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I lost track of my time there. So yeah, I'll try and draw my remarks to a close. So that activity by Hamas has nothing in common with the traditions of freedom struggles across the globe. Nothing. The taking of civilian prisoners and the holding of them for that length of time has nothing in common with the struggle for freedom of the various freedom fighters across the world. But nonetheless, to bring my remarks towards a conclusion, there will be a split undoubtedly in Hamas, because it can't. Its objective is to wipe out the Israeli state and to create a single unified Islamic Republic stretching from the Mediterranean Sea across to the Jordan River, including Israel. Now, it's impossible of achievement. That can't be. That just can't happen. And the rule that Hamas follows, or did follow, in their own country is repressive and oppressive in terms of its own population. So there's no possibility whatever of that succeeding. So there will be a split at some stage in Hamas. But the kind of demands that are the kind of issues that should be focused on. First of all, there has to be a class approach. This has to be based on the working class of the various countries of the Middle East, not just the Arab countries, but also Israel. The struggle in Palestine can't be isolated. There is no solution to the Palestine question just around Palestine. It has to involve all of the states. Now, I'm not saying that all the Arab states, that there's no national differences. There are nations and there are national differences. But the Arab peoples have to come together to try and find a solution to the Palestinian question and not leave it just to Palestinians. And in the past, Arab states have shown little interest in solving the Palestinian question. The national rights of the Palestinian people, the human rights of all the peoples, has to be part of any resolution. There are immediate demands in terms of dispossession, and that's part of the reason why the PLO is so unpopular, because they carry out the security policy of the Israeli government in the West Bank. Most of the Palestinian leaders became involved in business deals, corruption, and also very, very wealthy people themselves. When I was in the West Bank, I saw some of the houses that these people own. They live abroad, by the way. A lot of them don't live in Palestine. They live in other countries, particularly around the Gulf states, but they own big properties and real estate across the West Bank. So it's not surprising that the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO and Al-Fatah, became extremely unpopular, and Hamas then won a victory in the election of 2006 on that basis. There's been no election since. There has been an election in the West Bank where actually Al-Fatah and the PLO have gone up somewhat in terms of their voting results, but there's been no election in Gaza since 2006. So class unity is the only answer, and the class unity has to involve Israel as much as Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and all these countries of the Middle East. And the only solution, and even though it might seem a bit abstract at the moment, the only solution to the question is a socialist federation of the countries of what we now call the Middle East, including the Arab countries and Israel. So even though that might sound a bit airy-fairy, it is the only way in which this problem can be resolved. There is no solution for Palestine itself in isolation. There is no solution by bringing together all the Arab states, the monarchies, the Gulf monarchies, the various repressive regimes. There's no solution under Islam. This notion that the Islamic teachings in the Quran contain the solution, that's not true. The answer has to be based on socialist policies and a socialist approach and an internationalist approach. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks very much, Finn, for quite a comprehensive view of the conditions in Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East. Comrades, could you please indicate when you want to come in? And I'm very pleased to welcome Marcia. You'll see the name, on the screen, who's now joined us from Swakopmund in Namibia. You're very welcome, Marcia. We look forward to having many more discussions with you. Comrades, please indicate, and let's have a discussion worthy of the subject. Matthew? And then indicate any other indications after Matthew?
All right. Hi, comrades.
Okay.
There's lots of things to unpack here. I think, given the fact, obviously limited time, obviously we need to concentrate on the current conflict, and some of the factors. I think there's a few things. First of all, if you look at the history of Hamas, actually, of course, Hamas is the Palestine branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's where it comes from. It's also, of course, well known and documented that actually the formation of Hamas was facilitated by the Israeli Shin Bet, the political police, in 1987. So, as a means actually of splitting the PLO, which is done very successfully. The point being, as Finn said, is that of course obviously the Hamas is popular because of the corruption and the role of particularly obviously the dominant Fatah faction within the PLO, which of course has become essentially with the Oslo Accords become a secondary security contractor for the Israelis, and also is deeply corrupt. I mean, the thing is obviously Gaza is basically a prison camp, and essentially a prison camp, because most of its population is those who were driven into Gaza by the 1947-48 Nakba, the disaster in which people were driven out of what is now 48 Israel, and that actually, of course, therefore you have this incredibly densely populated area with very limited means of income, and of course you have then of course the Fatah people being essentially becoming very rich and driving around in nice cars, etc., etc. And so when Hamas kicked them out in 2007-8, and it was quite popular. And in fact, of course, the election, the reason why there isn't an election for the Palestinian Authority, of course, abandoned the election in 2008 because they lost. And certainly, and therefore Hamas took over the Strip, and we can look at all the other factions of the PLO as well, and that's another question. I think there's other things in terms of the role of imperialism, and the role of imperialism is central. I mean, the US, Israel exists, as Biden has said repeatedly. If it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's there, and it is subsidized daily by the US, and its military exists on the basis of basically an unending supply of weaponry and cooperation by the US. And it's the US actually that therefore has to agree every single major operation of the Israeli military. The invasion of Gaza was agreed by you can actually look it up in the phone log. If you look at the phone log of the White House on the 8th of October, Biden actually spoke to Netanyahu and said, "Yeah, you can go ahead, do what you want, and we will supply the weapons." And there's been a daily supply of weapons by air on these enormous C-17 aircraft to bomb Gaza. It's a US operation. The US has actually, according to the Wall Street Journal, on 1st of December, has by that point supplied, I think, 15,000 bombs of varying sizes from 500 pounds to 2,000 pounds, including 100 of these 2,000 pound penetrating bombs in order to destroy buildings. Had also supplied 57,000 155 mil. Which is the sort of standard normal howitzer size shells in order to shell Gaza. So this is the process. It's actually an imperialist operation, and you can see all the imperialist countries, as we see all the imperialist countries in real terms, have actually backed that. You can go through the whole lot. Europe, the UK, the rest of it. All of them. And you can watch in terms of the practical things they've done. I think the other thing, the thing is also that the role both of the enormous protest movement, which is run around the world. I think Al Jazeera counted in excess. Some few days ago, in excess of 7,000 protests in all countries of the world against the war on Gaza, some of which have involved millions of people. And we've all seen, in fact, a whole layer of politicians actually being exposed to the entire population as a bunch of bloodthirsty murderers, because they've all supported this thing. It's done enormous damage in political terms to the imperialists, both in their own countries and everywhere else. And we can see, you know, the common thing now is genocide Joe Biden. And he's likely to lose the election next year in part because of it. I think you know, in terms of the 7th of October, the important thing is that the 7th of October is that this is people breaking out of a concentration camp, breaking out of a prison camp. They have an absolute right to do it, absolute right to do it, and we as revolutionaries should absolutely support that. You know, there's no equivocation about it. Now, obviously, we can then say, well, what we would do once we've broken out of that prison camp would be different, might be different. But the fact that the people have done it, they have an absolute, even under bourgeois international law, they have an absolute right to break out of prison camp, which is what they did. And the point is also, the other thing, of course, is that what's actually been said about the 7th of October by Israel is largely lies, of course. Because actually, of course, that much of the slaughter was conducted by the IDF. I'm muting myself by accident. It's now coming out in the Israeli media itself that, in fact, of course, much of the slaughter was conducted through using the use of IDF tanks and helicopter gunships. Because Hamas and the Islamic Jihad and everybody else who went through the wire were carrying small arms. They weren't carrying rockets. They weren't carrying tank shells. They couldn't demolish buildings. They couldn't burn. They didn't have a facility to burn huge areas of cars. They just didn't have that kind of weaponry. You know, that's what happened. And the problem is that the story of that's not been told. And the other thing, of course, is that you know, what we're seeing, of course, is a tremendous sort of effort to put forward an enormous degree of lies. When you look at all the bourgeois media, it's full of shit. It really is full of shit. You know, the Israelis put out these low-grade lies, and it's the media actually refuses to report, you know, anything else in many cases.
Matthew,
sorry,
if you could start drawing your remarks.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, as I say, even in terms of protests, I mean, we've had enormous protests. We've had it every single week here. We've had a protest, and there's absolutely zero media, none at all. In terms of this city in Glasgow, these are the biggest protests we've had in years, and certainly the biggest series of protests. I mean, nobody's ever done this for over 2 months, and there's no coverage, none whatsoever, apart from obviously what people post on social media, because it actually hits right against that class interest. There's an absolute block on it, and I think that the thing is, I mean, I think just to say, I mean, I think that in terms of the other thing, of course, is the split in Israeli society itself. And what Netanyahu is trying to do is to get round the fact that Israeli society spent a year split, I mean, radically on the street. And he's, you know, in those terms, staging this war in order to try and save his own neck, which of course he isn't going to. But you know, all of this is open for question. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks for those points, Matthew. Look, just before I invite Steve to come in, you know, I want to draw attention to the fact we've got other comrades joining us who we should note and mention, as well as Marcia. We've got Comrade Mahindra and Laxman from Mumbai. Comrades, you're welcome, and we look forward to hearing you. And also we've got Comrade Danusha from Sri Lanka. We're also pleased to see you, although we can't quite see you just right now. You're very welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you as well. Well done, comrades. We look forward to your participation. Steve, please go ahead.
Thank you, David. Obviously, we're all agreed here that we're opposed to this war. There is a mass anti-war movement that I'm sure we're all participating in wherever we are in the world, and it's a fantastically powerful movement, international movement. But obviously, beyond that, we are thinking here about what kind of peace could there be? What kind of solutions? That's really what we're kind of thinking of today. Not we're taking it as given. that we're opposed to this war and we're for an immediate ceasefire and peace. And I think they come into two types of solutions. One is what you might call socialist solutions, which basically say there isn't really a national solution. You really need an international, you need a kind of socialist federation. So that means you need a socialist Egypt, a socialist Saudi Arabia, a socialist Iran, a socialist Syria, and socialist Egypt, if I haven't mentioned them already. And if those transformations take place, then they would enable maybe the Israeli working class to break with Zionism. You know, so in other words, it almost has to come from outside the area to, as it were, to inspire people inside the area to break with this horrendous thing. I think the alternative to that is to think about democratic solutions. And by democratic solutions, I mean solutions that can have the support of the majority of the people in that area. That is to say, the majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinians. And I think if we're going to think in that direction, we have to think of the idea of a democratic republic, some kind of democratic republican solution, which has to be secular. So we have to have a secular, because obviously, as a speaker outlined, the way in which religion works all the way through the whole of the Middle East, we as socialists must be democrats and secularists, and we must be prepared to advocate that. The question would be, well, what kind of democratic republic could that be? And I think there's a case to be made for the idea of having what's sometimes called a binational state. That is to say, a federal republic, or let's call it a state. One state, two nations. One state being of Israel, Palestine, the two nations being Israel and Palestine. A republic with self-determination for both. In other words, the right to join or the right to leave the federation. That means self-determination for the Palestinian people, of course. And I think federalism has got something to say about how people can come together. Now, who's going to bring that about? It's not going to be the Americans. It's not going to be the Israelis or the Zionists. The only force that can bring that about, it seems to me, is the working class. The only force in that area, the Israeli working class, the Palestinian working class, are the only force that can really do that, bring that about, make that possible. And I feel we as socialists should advocate that. But not seeing that as an end in itself. I think a democratic republic is a transitional demand, if you like. In other words, if we could go down that road, we would be heading towards a wider socialist revolution in the Middle East. So I'm going to stop there, but I think we should put down in consideration a federal republic of Israel and Palestine with the right of nations to self-determination as an alternative. I don't think we can go back to the idea that you could have a single Palestinian democratic republic with Israel just liquidated or abolished or whatever. I think that's something that is no longer possible. But a federal republic of Israel would have to be a de-Zionized Israel, a secular Israel, not one based on Jewish supremacism. After all, 20% of the Israelis are Arabs or Palestinians, and they're second-class citizens. So there has to be 20% of the working class in Israel to start with would be interested in a solution of that type, I think. I'll stop there so other comrades can come.
Thanks, Steve. I think we now can, hear Andros. Could I say after Andros, I would like to make some points, and I'll pass the chair over. I promise to remain within 4 to 5 minutes. Andros, please come in.
Hello, comrades. To start with, I think that the importance of the history of the national problem in Israel-Palestine is very important because the new generation doesn't know about it. 20 years ago, and much more so 30 years ago, it would be impossible to present Israel as the victim of Palestinian aggression or even of Hamas aggression, because it was very well understood and known in the mass populations of the planet that Israel was the occupying force. This memory has been lost, and I think we need to take up the history and explain how the Israeli Jews from a very small minority, which actually had very important class traditions, and in the 1920s, that's 1 century ago, we would have many struggles common struggles of Arab and Israeli workers on a class basis and on a socialist basis. There were very prominent class fighters among the Arabs, but also among the Israeli Jews. But from a very small minority, I think it was around 5% of the population then. We now come in a situation in which the Palestinians have been turned into a very small minority, with nearly 80% of the population being Israeli Jews, and the Palestinians being crushed in very small regions and being threatened all the time with what you call them, the settlers. That's one thing. The second thing about the issue of Palestine today, I think, is that we have a very powerful anti-war movement on a global scale, which is putting serious pressure on the imperialist centers in Europe, in Britain, in the US, which was not the case with the Ukraine war. And in a certain sense, it's reflecting a kind of instinct on the part of the people of the planet that in the case the war in Ukraine is not theirs, in a sense that it's fundamentally an inter-imperial struggle, whereas the war on Gaza is an attack by an agent of imperialism, or what's the word, of an outpost of imperialism against a people that has been suffering. So we had demonstrations of hundreds of thousands in the West, but of course we had demonstrations of millions in countries which are Arab or Muslims. And just to take a note of this, I think the Western powers, the US and European powers, the Britain, are losing ground in the geopolitical conflict they had with China and the US, because China and Russia are taking a position which is pro-Palestinian, despite the fact that they want to have relations with Israel. And this is seen by the hundreds of millions of Arabs, but also of Muslims. Together, they nearly approach about 1.5 billion people. So that's one thing. The other thing, which I think is very important also, and Finn has touched upon it, is the role of the left in the region. When we say left, we mean pro-Stalinist left, pro-Soviet Union left in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was actually the betrayal of these forces of Marxism, and as a result of that, of the class nature of the Palestine question, that allowed organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon to acquire such power. We should remember that the pro-Soviet left in the 70s and the 80s had massive strength in the region. Communist parties of 30, 40, 45% of the population in countries like Sudan, or pro-Soviet countries in Iraq. We all know the Assad regime in Syria, which was anti-Western and pro-Soviet. Similarly, to big extent, is Gaddafi in Libya. We should remember that Egypt approached the Soviet Union after the Six-Day War in 1967 and proposed to join the Soviet alliance, and the Soviet Union refused. So Egypt wanted to join the Soviet bloc, and the Soviet Union said, no, we will disturb our relations with the West. This was the power that the Stalinist left had in the region. And of course, the PLO was a pro-Soviet organization. But all of these forces, they had the idea of the stages theory. And as a result, they failed. And of course, the PLO, after a certain stage, they tried guerrilla warfare, and then they went to terrorism. And that was the beginning of the end, I would say. But this failure of the left and the desperation of the people of Palestine and other Arab nations, of course, as well, created the ground for the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism as a force which, despite the fact that it has a lot of support in big sections of Palestinians and Arabs, this is out of desperation, and it's not a progressive force. It's a reactionary political force. Now, Comrade Steve, I think is his name, raised the idea of proposing a democratic republic to include both peoples, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And of course, if the ruling classes and if the imperialist powers could implement such a solution, we would welcome it. It would be good if capitalism could find a solution, even if it's problematic and even if it's temporary. Anything would be better than the present situation. But I don't think it's possible that Israel can accept any one of the two scenarios. It would be impossible for Israel under capitalism to accept a unified state, because then the Jews will be a minority and it will become a Palestinian state. So that's out of the question. But the possibility of creating a Palestinian state next to the Israeli state, although theoretically it cannot be excluded, I think it's not possible in the present era. Maybe in some decades it can be possible. But now they would not accept an independent state next to the present Israeli state, because it would mean that what Hamas and Hezbollah are doing underground and in the dark, they will be able to do openly in the name of their state, independent state. So Israel would not want to do this. It's possible in the future, but that would be quite a long-term future, in my opinion, that they could allow some kind of Palestinian state, but it would not be really independent. It would have to be under their control and under their, it would be their people in Palestine controlling the Palestinian people, something similar to what is happening in the West Bank. But I think that would not solve the problem. It would change the character of the problem. But there will still be desperation in the masses, and there will still be the ground for radical Islamism or Islamic fundamentalism, or this madness that we see with the Hamas people who, I mean, it's real madness, because they train the people that they live for one dream, to kill one Jew, even if they lose their life, because if they do this, they will go to paradise. This is completely irrational. And out of the past traditions of the Palestinian left, which was very progressive and very open-minded 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that is lost. I finish because I know I'm speaking a lot. Yes, socialism is the only answer, although it looks very distant because we don't have the forces, either in the region or internationally. But we have to raise it. A socialist federation is the only way forward. And we simply have to get on the task of gradually building these forces consistently, persistently, and patiently, of course, because we've got a long road ahead of us. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks so much, Andros. Thanks for bringing to bear quite a lot of past experience in dealing with the issue. I wondered if I could hand over chair briefly to Pam and make some, points of, not from the chair with any authority, but some personal points that I would like to bring in.
You've got 5 minutes.
Comrade, Well, please roar at me if I'm approaching 4.
Okay.
Comrades, you know, we know that from our own experience now, but also from Clausewitz's statement, that war is the extension of politics by other means. But we can also add to that, and maybe we need a thorough discussion sometimes of the nature of war under capitalism, because war is not unique to capitalism. But it's carried forward on the most extraordinary international scale, you know, under capitalism, particularly under that of globalization, where just about every war today becomes a proxy war of some kind or other, even including that in Sudan, which appears to be a purely internal war, but actually has very important support from outside to complete the obliteration of the working class and any prospect for democracy in that country. So in other words, I'm trying to look at the politics here, and I think we're all trying to do that. And I think Ben, you gave us quite an exploration of one side or some aspects of. Now, if I could bring in, you know, some points, you know, which I've been noticing. You know, this war has been the culmination of a huge struggle in Israel itself. Let's look at one side of the equation first, in which Netanyahu has been trying to wriggle free from any control by the Supreme Court and any form of parliamentary control which would displace him from being the prime minister. I think he's been now the prime minister, I think, for something like 17 years in and out. It's an extraordinary thing, and he wants to continue that kind of democratic dictatorship. So what we've had on the one side, even before, and I'll deal with some of the catastrophes of their intelligence, which is him personally rising above the state, using every trick in the book to be able to dictate to the Israeli people and through elections to be able to get a majority to crush the democratic aspirations, the democratic achievements of the Israeli working class. And to some extent, we've been indifferent to this because it didn't seem to be, well, I wouldn't say indifferent, but we didn't really understand the significance of what was taking place. Now we can see with the war exactly where he was heading. And we can see the evidence also on the West Bank. I've just been reading an article by the Washington Post in which you know, he's explaining to the Democrats, the Democratic Party, and to America that there is no way there can be a resolution of any of the grievances of the Palestinian people without wrenching away power, you know, from the Zionist state. And actually, in a sense, he's just recognizing the real politic of this. And I have to bring this to bear in relation to Steve's various solutions, because actually each one of those solutions is an ideal which is not accessible, you know, right now. And I would suggest, I'll come back to that in the conclusion, what real politic will deliver us out of the horrific mess which we see in front of our eyes. One of the points I would like to bring about, you know, to mention. It's through the kind of coup which Netanyahu was undertaking within the Israeli state, you know, was against you know, all the Israeli groups which were favoring any form of peace. In other words, his was a war strategy without being called explicitly a war strategy, and it's part of a general right-wing shift in the bourgeois. He's Trump in Israel. There's a close connection between Trump and all of the extreme right-wing of Europe and in Israel. It's a manifestation of the catastrophe which the bourgeois is seeing in front of itself, and the desperate measures, you know, they are adopting, which are based on hatred of the other and an extreme exacerbation of nationalist and religious tensions. Now, the problem within Israel, if I could use that term now, is that the Palestinian people who could have stopped Netanyahu through a vote, I've just been looking at the arithmetic here. There are 2 or 3 Palestinian groups which stood in the election. Previously, the Palestinian group had 13 seats in the Knesset and could have stopped Netanyahu coming to power. But unfortunately, in the last election, as I understand it, they didn't. Their standards stood separately, and actually their number of seats actually diminished, and they were unable to block the extreme division in Israeli society and allow, in a sense, through the divisions internally within Israel itself, to allow him, to take power. And remember, he only came to power, I think, with 1 or 2 seats or 1 or 2 votes on his side.
David, you've been speaking for 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. Let me just move to the other side, and I'll be brief. On the other side, we've seen what Finn has developed on the divisions. Let me just mention the broader divisions. Just remember that shortly before the 7th of October, there was about to be what they call the Abrahamic Accords. So one after the other of the Arab states was moving into an alliance with Israel, Zionist Israel, against the Palestinian people. So we can see that part of the crisis that the Palestinian people face is that although all the Arab states will obviously vote in the United Nations and so forth, for a ceasefire or something else, they do not tolerate any opposition to their position of collaboration with the Israeli state. They will suppress or kill any journalists speaking about this. And so we have these Bonapartist dictatorships, which are either in collusion with Russia, as in the case of Iran, or in collusion as collaborators with U.S. imperialism. So we see a very divided state, which a state of nations in the Middle East. And again, we have to return then how we can organize the working class, not in its practical struggles, to be able to talk the language of peace and actually to be able to bring this to bear and to break against the grip of Bonapartist dictatorships throughout the region. Thank you, comrades. Sorry, I'm now reverting to the chair. And Nigel, please come in. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, David. Just a brief contribution, I think. I'd like to turn on to the interacting in the movement. We were talking about mass protests and so on. The protests are taking place all over, and I mean, certainly in the area where I live, there's been a cycle of protests across Saturdays, across Sundays, Fridays, lobbies of the local MP who didn't vote for a ceasefire as a Labour MP, and a lot of that by the local Muslim community in Halifax, which is quite a big Muslim community in Halifax. And so there's been a lot of, kind of that kind of stuff taking place. And so in intervening with this, there's been some interesting developments. There's been calls for the local MP to resign. There's been, especially amongst the Asian community, there's been calls for standing against the asking the councillors to stand down, asking the Asian councillors to leave Labour and to stand down and not support the Labour Party because of Keir Starmer's appalling position on this and the Labour Party's appalling position on this in general. So there's been a feeling of Islamophobia coming from the state. So this feeling amongst the Muslim community that they are second-class citizens, that the Jewish lobby is favoured over themselves, and that this is a really a strong feeling and a strong feeling internationally. Comrade Andros is very right when he talks about a lack of understanding of the views in general. A lot of people support us on our act, but there are also people who oppose us, people who heckle us and challenge us, and have a very one-dimensional view of what's taking place, which is difficult to counter because the mass media in the UK is extremely pro-Israel and anti-Hamas. but also anti-Palestinian, basically, in essence. But in spite of that, there's a balanced view in terms of support for Palestine or Israel in a kind of simple way, which isn't the same in the United States. There's much more pro. If you look at the numbers, there's a much more pro-Israeli position there generally in the population. So this is leading to also some political, I think, thought. So on the events that I'm attending, there are a lot of Muslim Asians at those events. Women are leading, as well as children, and girls, as well as little boys, are involved in the chanting. Women are starting to talk about politics. So I was having a really interesting conversation yesterday with a Muslim woman who was very clear that she was now becoming interested in politics for the first time, but that she'd felt excluded politically previously, and that she was coming into conflict with the elders of the mosque around organizing, and that the men were trying to keep the women down. She was describing organizing a trip to London and booking coaches and being told that they couldn't the women had to go on women's coaches only and the men on men's coaches, and they couldn't have a women's coach because there wouldn't be enough interest. So she organized a coach for the women. In the end, I'll cut the long story short. It's a very long story. But in the end, she organized a series of coaches, 4 coaches for the women. 35 women went on these minibuses that she had managed to get when she was told there weren't any. And this is by a local councillor who's also an elder of the mosque. And 19 men went on the coach he'd booked. So he conspired to stop the women going. But she's come up against that for the first time. Her eyes are opening and she's becoming more interested in politics. So she's interested in meeting in the new year, trying to get something going in the area around developing whether, the women and whether that community kind of, and we agree politically. So that's an interesting development. This is somebody coming into the struggle for the first time and really moving forward very, very fast, which is a revolutionary development for her. This is a radical change in her thoughts. Now, that conversation I was having the other day has been replicated all over the place, I'm sure. So there is an effect on consciousness, and this is something we need to take account of as well and try and engage with that wherever we can. Thank you.
You've muted yourself, David.
And I've tried to unmute myself half a dozen times. Sorry, apologies. Dominic, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, it's just a few points. I think one of the things we've got to say about the 7th of October event, from a class point of view, is, as far as I'm concerned, Netanyahu and his actions are a recruiting sergeant for Hamas, and Hamas, by its actions on the 7th of October, are a recruiting sergeant for Zionism within the Israeli population, the Jewish Israeli population. I think that's something we've got to say. Where does it take society? Where does it take the working class? Where does it take any elements who are looking for a solution in Palestine? All you're going to say is it's quite justified for both sides to kick the SH-1C out of each other, and doesn't matter how many they kill or what circumstances happen. As far as I see the situation, the world capitalists are not one slightest bit interested in any solution in the interests of the Palestinians. They're supplying arms to Israel, which even if the arms were stopped, would stop the bombing, would stop all the activities on the part of the Zionist government, far-right Zionist government. On the question of a two-state solution, there's no way of bringing that about without a revolutionary situation. In the West Bank now, you've got 700,000 illegal settlers. What's his name? Ben-Gvir, who's a security minister, has recently handed out 10,000 assault rifles with body armor and all the rest of it. And Biden has just stopped the shipment of a further shipment of small arms of 20-odd thousand, because he wants to make a little gesture. And that's all the Western people are doing. When they're calling for ceasefires, it's conditional. Hamas has got to do this, Hamas has got to do that. The Palestinians have got to do that, this and that. When you look at what's happened in Gaza, there's hardly a building standing. There's hardly a hospital there. The roads have been dug up. You've got disease starting to spread. You've got a situation where there are token, if you like, starvation rations being allowed into Gaza by the Israelis, something like 100 or less trucks at a time. Before the events of October the 7th, there was something like 500 to 600 truckloads going into Gaza every day. People are fighting for food. Hunger is spreading. Water, they're drinking dirty water, which is a basis of disease spreading. And that's all going on under the noses of world capitalism, of the Arabs, who are the Arab capitalists and feudalists and God knows what, who are surrounding it. If the Arab leaders were interested in taking a step forward to a ceasefire, the only thing they have to do is turn off the oil taps. That would devastate the West. The threat of that would devastate the West. You'd have a stock market crash, I would think, if they actually threatened to do that. All they're doing is looking at the same verbiage as what's his name, as all the leaders in America, in Britain, in Germany, and what have you. So as far as the working class are concerned, there's no solution in anything they're going to set up, because they're going to set up nothing apart from the expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza and the expulsion of the Palestinians in the West Bank into Jordan, and the other one into Egypt. Netanyahu's already been discussing massive sums to be paid to the Israelis and to the Egyptians and to the Jordan governments about taking the Palestinians into those countries and setting up presumably refugee camps, refugee prisons. Egypt is frightened to death of having a couple of million Palestinians who have gone through what they've gone through with the Egyptian government holding its hands and basically wanting to get into bed with the Israeli government. And that's the situation around that whole area as David was talking about. So the thing to me is, it's not what the Western powers or the Arab powers are going to do. It's a question of what is going to transform in the next period. And I would see that there's going to be turmoil. There is turmoil from what I can gather on the streets in the Arab countries surrounding Israel. Demands for action, demands for this, demands for that. And I think that this is exposing to an extent what Toothless wonders, all this nonsense about, the Arab states and, the anti-Zionism or fighting against them and protecting the people. It shows that the Arab leaders in the area are not interested in protecting the Palestinians, no more than they're interested in protecting their own population. And I think that the solution to Palestine, to my view, is going to develop in the countries around it. It's the working class in the areas around that are going to have to take up the banner to raise the thing about workers' democracy within these countries. And that's going to be a fight that needs to be spread. It's not going to be something that is going to be, given to them. But what other lessons can they learn from what's going on, other than that their corrupt governments are absolutely corrupt and totally useless, and that as Finn was saying, Hamas has got 50-odd% support where it's governing. Where it's not governing, it's got 70% support. That speaks volumes about that organisation. That the experience of that organisation turns people off, not gathers them to it. So it's a bit jumbled, but I think that's a few points I just wanted to throw in. I think the thing is, it's not going to be settled within Israel, Palestine. It's got to be settled by the working class, and I would say initially by the working class surrounding that country. I'll leave it at
that. Thanks for that contribution. Comrades, just to make a few general points before we can have other comrades coming in who've already spoken. Please, if we could indicate who've not yet spoken. Could I also raise a point which takes further, the point has been made. Egypt is not allowing Palestinians from Gaza into its territory. And the reason is because it doesn't want the Muslim Brotherhood, which they've got tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands in prison. They slaughtered the Muslim Brotherhood. So the last thing they want is a bunch of politically active youth who are going to come and then mobilize against Sisi and against the government in Egypt. And that would be a catastrophe for the United States and also for Israel. So in a sense, the prison has two sides. On the one side, there's Israel. On the other side, there's Egypt blocking any attempt for Palestinians to escape from the slaughter they're experiencing. And I think this is not developed anywhere, and I think we need to bring it out very clearly. Sisi is totally hostile to Hamas and will not allow refuge for Palestinians, women or children, into Palestine, into Egypt, because you fear the consequence. I want to then just raise this point and see what we think. We've raised what we can talk about in a kind of sociological sense, ideal types. We could have a socialist federation. We could have a binational state or something of that kind. What we see in front of our eyes, and what is the headlines right now, is that engagement and negotiations going to be taking place directly between the Zionist regime and Hamas, not in the territory, but away from the territory, either apparently in Norway or elsewhere, where they're going to talk the terms for releasing the hostages on the one side and the hostages on the other side. In other words, what de facto we are seeing is a kind of a standoff in which Israel talks about Hamas as a terrorist state, but in fact recognizes its power. So that's the one side. On the other side, it seems that Hamas is not interested or doesn't see any future apart from eliminating the Israeli state and the Israeli people, or the people who are identifying themselves as Jewish, in that community. But this uneasy, despicable, disgusting sort of exchange and is a kind of temporary equilibrium. And it invites us to think about all the unsatisfactory conclusions there have been to armed struggle in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, where the incompatibles remain incompatible, but they sit there not killing each other for a while, but actually just living in a state of permanent tension, which in the relation to China and America, I've talked about a state of near war. And I wonder, but it's carrying on. I wouldn't say equilibrium is not the word, but something of that kind. So let's also think about what actual regimes are going to emerge in the next period out of the negotiations which are currently taking place, a mutual recognition from Hamas that it had put out everything into the battle to eliminate the Israeli state, and it's had devastating consequences from the people. That's the one side. On the other side, that the Israeli state was completely blinded by the Bonapartist reaction, so that they didn't take out elementary precautions, completely headstrong, almost drunk on power, and unable to be able to understand what was coming for them on the other side, and yet for a while, possibly an uneasy equilibrium out of the devastation and the total destruction of Gaza. But I'll raise that as something for us to discuss. Matthew, please come in, and then Steve, and please anyone else who has not yet spoken indicate.
Right, comrades, I would agree with what Nigel said. We are seeing some very impressive Muslim women coming through on the protests, in terms of organising stuff and discussing politics. It's been really something else in those terms, and I think it's replicated everywhere. I think really what we should actually also talk about really is the nature of the disintegration of the Zionist project, and really the splits that were going on before this started. I mean, the problem, what you've got, of course, is clearly a split profound split in Israeli society. Netanyahu, the problem with Netanyahu, of course, first of all, he's a crook, and what he's trying to do is remain prime minister so he doesn't go to jail. Secondly, of course, that basically he's trying to ratchet the whole lot in order to preserve his own power. He's actually ratcheted the whole politics to the far right in Israel, and was actually responsible for consolidating the Jewish fascist parties, the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and these people, into viable organizations so they could get elected into the Knesset, and thus would be available for him to form a coalition with. And then, of course, obviously the nature of Israel as a state, which is, I mean, it's actually now formalized in law that it is racist. And the problem is, of course, when we could, other comrades have made the point about this whole battle of the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court is quite fine with things like torture and killing of Palestinians. That's perfectly okay, as far as they're concerned. In legal terms in Israeli law, and it's not a question of there isn't a question, okay, of the control, who has control over the excesses of Netanyahu and the tendency towards Bonapartism and so on, and some form of dictatorship, which of course is not just an Israeli question, it's also a question for the US, and it become even more. This will become even more obvious next year as we go to the US election, which the question of dictatorship will be very frankly put. The thing is that obviously then we see this split, in which we have, Israel is quite a small country, but we see, demonstrations of hundreds of thousands or more, on a regular basis, mass strikes, including general strikes and so on. The split clearly between, also, of course, a section of the main section, in fact, of the Israeli bourgeoisie, which is against what is being done. So I mean, the key question of, likes of the cyber guys and all these people, the tech guys who are saying, well, we're not investing in this crap anymore, which they said, okay, we'll take our money out. And then, of course, the settlers, which are actually the settler movement is the basis for the Israeli fascists and the far right. And that's the logic. I mean, the question is, that's the logic of the Zionist project, is in order to both to expel more Palestinians, and of course to suppress those, or preferably expel those Palestinians who even hold Israeli passports, all of which of course have been devalued by the racist nature of the state, in which they now formally don't have the rights of Jewish Israelis. So the question was, okay, you have these mass demonstrations, and the problem being, okay, well, it's incomplete, isn't it? Because obviously what they're saying is we want to preserve certain things about the nature of the system, but we're not addressing the demonstrations were openly and nakedly not addressing the key question, which is what kind of state is it? The fact you can't have a democratic state which is based on the suppression of millions of people over a period of 60 years. And how do you end the occupation? That's the core of it. If you want a democratic state, you have to end the occupation. You can't do it any other way. Okay, I mean, there were actually, of course, people, I think, particularly around Hadash, which is centered around the Israeli Communist Party, for whatever its political, whatever political issues we may have with it, actually posed that question on the demonstrations, and in some cases were attacked for it. I mean, this would be the line. Obviously, I would take. A lot of people actually on the left say, well, we should just ignore the whole bloody thing because they're all Zionists. And who cares? No, I mean, I don't agree. I mean, obviously, if your opposition is split, you have to take advantage of the fact, and you have to put the key question to the society and say, look, this is the nature of the thing. But obviously, you're seeing it. Large sections of the left saying, well, it doesn't matter because they're all bloody Zionists. Now, the thing is, the question being, okay, how do we then intervene in that? But also, how do we understand that? And the point being is obviously, this war, from Netanyahu's point of view and the point of view of the fascists, is in order to try and paper over that. Now, the thing is that all it will do is accelerate it. And now you're going to get even more demands for Netanyahu to go and be removed, not only by by a whole series of people, not only those people who
Matthew, if you could draw,
but also by the US, because obviously the US is not overly in favor of Netanyahu either, but it's actually to try and explore some of that. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Look, Kieran, did you want to come in again just before Steve?
Yes, David, can I come in?
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to come in? I didn't see a hand, but I do get a notice on chat.
Yes.
Did you want to come in again? Yeah.
No. Yes.
Before
yes.
You
thank you, David. Just relatively briefly. Okay. So it's a very good lead off and a good discussion, but it does illustrate the difficulty we have in discussing just a complex issue in a short period of time. And I would suggest that we think about a schedule of discussions in the new year, perhaps 2 or 3 discussions in an organized fashion over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, where we go through some of the aspects of this particularly complex issue in a more methodical fashion. So, for example, the history of the region, up to, we could take it up to October the 7th, October the 6th, or perhaps up to the 1990s Oslo Accords, but draw a line and look back on the history of events over the course of centuries and decades in order to orientate ourselves more fully. We need to think then about what has happened over the course of the last short period of time and think that through, think about the character, the nature of Hamas, to think about the nature, the character of the current Israeli government, and understand where we are now. And then we do need to discuss what happens next. And I just want to comment on that briefly. And it's the point that you made, David, about a new equilibrium. Because this war will end, this war will not continue forever. That's stating the obvious. And it will not end with a successful socialist revolution in the Middle East. We are optimists, but we know that's not going to happen in the short to medium term. It's not going to solve the problem now for the masses in the region. So there will be a new equilibrium, and we need to think a little bit more about what might happen and what our position should be, depending on how events unfold. Already we can see the beginning of an outline of how it might come to an end. There are indications, for example, that the Israeli state, Netanyahu, some of the leading figures, are beginning to raise tentatively just the idea that they won't smash Hamas, that Hamas just won't be atomized, won't disappear. They're beginning to hint at that because they have to. Because after now 3.5 months, they've obviously, we can assume, scored or killed several thousand Hamas fighters, but Hamas remains intact as a military force at this point. They will continue their offensive for a period of time, but at some stage they will have to call a halt to this phase under American pressure. And some comrades made the point that the West and America doesn't care. And that's true, and it's not true. You know, the American imperialism doesn't care about the blood and the bones of innocents anywhere in the world, but American imperialism does value stability everywhere, and they will want to restabilize the situation. So in that sense, they do care, and they will put pressure on the Israeli state. So we know at some point it'll come to an end. I think it's excluded at this point that it will come to an end by the expulsion of the Palestinian population of Gaza from Gaza. I think that is excluded. If it was going to happen, it would have begun to happen. The Israeli state cannot make it happen. The Egyptian state does not, as comrades already said, have sealed the border. They do want an influx of refugees, but the Palestinian masses in the main don't want to move, don't want to go. Everything says it's not going to happen, and it's even less likely to happen in the West Bank. The expulsion of the Palestinians is not going to happen. So the restabilization, I think, will take the several forms. One is that eventually the offensive will end, and the Israeli state will create a buffer zone 1, 2, 3 miles wide around the Gaza Strip. Then there'll be a period of uneasy peace. And what happens at that point? I think the Hamas structure will re-emerge, you know, perhaps rebadged in some way, perhaps hidden in some way, but it will re-emerge. And the question then is whether it will receive support from the Arab world, will begin to rebuild, but behind a buffer, which means that it is more difficult for it to attack Israel directly, and some kind of steps in order to prevent the missile attacks. But they may find it very difficult to do that. The alternative is that there's several alternatives. One is that the Israeli military stays on the ground, and they might consider that. They might consider it, but they do know it'll end badly, as it ended in Lebanon in the 1980s, the 1990s. They know they will have to withdraw at a certain point. It could end with Arab states putting their armed forces into the region to stabilize the situation into the Gaza Strip. But they don't want to do that, and I think it's unlikely. It might end by some form of an international peacekeeping force, a United Nations force, as there is in southern Lebanon. I think that's possible and may be considered, but it will end. And similarly, in the West Bank, there'll be restabilization at a certain point. And the big question for imperialism is whether they can do what they've indicated they would like to do, and that is to reimpose the authority of the Palestinian Authority, of Fatah, in Gaza. But Fatah has little authority in the West Bank, and how it rebuilds authority in Gaza after recent events is difficult to see. Now that's a very messy situation, and at some point, I think it's widely accepted by everyone that the Netanyahu government will fall. Perhaps new elections, perhaps the elections will be further to the right, but it's also possible under the pressure of events that there will be even a slight tilt to the left or to the centre, and the new government will be not a Netanyahu government, and less of a hard right government. And perhaps we're prepared to talk. If Joe Biden is returned as the American president, I think it's likely that there will be a determined drive for a new peace initiative and a determined drive towards the idea of a two-state solution, a capitalist two-state solution. And we all know how complex that is. We all know that the facts on the ground have changed since the 1990s, but that doesn't mean that they won't try. It doesn't mean that there wouldn't be at least consideration to some movement of settlers away from where they currently are in the West Bank. We know it's very complex, but we have to think about how it might play out. All of this eventually will end against all of the roadblocks. We understand that, but it might play out over the course of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That is possible. It also might end up in a further conflagration in the West Bank or in southern Lebanon. We don't know. Just again, on just some final 1 or 2 points, one or two comrades maybe have left the idea a little bit open that there could be an escalation. I think, again, we can say at this point that an escalation, whilst it's not excluded, is now very unlikely. If Hezbollah, under the tutelage of Iran, were going to escalate, they'd have done it by now. If there's going to be an escalation in the West Bank, it would have happened by now. I think an escalation is not going to happen, and it is the beginning of the end, in a sense, of this particular phase of the Arab-Israeli conflict over territory. So we should come back to all of this. We have to have positions at every step, so we can point out that there's no solution under capitalism, but it doesn't mean we don't take a position. It's the point that David made about Northern Ireland, for example. Northern Ireland, there's no solution under capitalism, but socialists, Marxists, revolutionaries, we have to take a position at every point on the concrete circumstances, and we would have to consider that over the course of the next period. So I think we should come back to this in an organised fashion in the new year. Perhaps two discussions, perhaps one that's more backward-looking and one that's more forward-looking. And we also, as a final point, sorry, I know I keep saying that, we need to think more about slogans. What are the slogans that are valid, that are useful, that clarify, that we should adopt, that we should use in the movement? I think we need to think about that more as well, where there is a confusion of slogans in the anti-war movement, in the pro-Palestine movement, that I think is not helpful, and that we need to consider, think through, and take a position on.
Thanks so much, Kieran. Steve, as the Zimbabweans sometimes say, time is becoming the enemy, but please come in and focus your comments exactly to the key points. And then, Finn, please be ready to come in and sum up the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I was very interested in the comments that you made, David, and Matthew, and Kieran. I think Kieran brought us down to a certain reality as well. And the points that you made, I think, were also very important. And I don't necessarily think they contradict the argument that I was making. I should say that I'm a supporter of the Republican Labour Education Forum. We've got a position paper on the idea of a democratic federal republic, and we're very happy to circulate it to any discussion and get comments from you, because that sets our case out more clearly than I can do in a couple of minutes. I wanted to make just one point. The idea of a democratic, secular federal republic of Israel and Palestine is actually, it's not something that could come from Zionism or America. In a certain sense, it's revolutionary as a democratic demand. It's about something coming from below, coming from the people. And if we say, well, where are the people that this is going to come from? We have to go back to the Israeli people. Remember that the war suppresses democratic movements. So this massive democratic movement in Israel that's taken everybody by surprise died, of course, with October the 7th. But it didn't die completely, because it's appeared now in those protests about the hostages. So there are people on the streets in Israel protesting, and it is a democratic protest against the way the government's operating. But that movement that existed before could easily come back if the war came to an end. Now, the question is, as has been said, that's not an anti-Zionist movement. They were mainly Zionists. They weren't, as Matthew, I think, pointed out, their program is very limited to defending the Supreme Court. But it doesn't mean that if people go to that level of argument as a mass movement, they can't start thinking, perhaps Israel should be more of a secular country. Perhaps it should be more of a democratic country. So I do see the seeds of a democratic Israel in those movements. So, and I think in Palestine, where they've not had an election, where I think, as somebody pointed out, Hamas is obviously popular because it's showed itself capable of fighting, but it's not necessarily popular with the people who think we've got no. It's like a dictatorship almost. They've got their dictatorship. We can't have an election. We can't elect anybody. We haven't had an election since 2007. So I think the figures that somebody gave about popularity of Hamas in Gaza falling, I think makes sense. I think there's a case for popular democratic movements in both Palestine and Israel, and that's the only place where a case for a democratic republic could come from. I'll stop at that point. Hopefully I can find a way of circulating our paper to you after the meeting or some form.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. I think we have to look at the clock and also defend to sum up on a very varied discussion. But please go ahead, Finn, and take it to the end.
Okay, comrades, it's been a very interesting and a very stimulating discussion. And the achievement of the meeting is to illustrate the complexity of the problem and the need to look at all of the questions that have been raised in a lot more detail. We can't solve the problems, nor do we strive to solve the problems of the Middle East. What we should aim at is to get an understanding of the nature of the organizations that are involved, so we can draw conclusions on the basis of that understanding. And likewise, the other forces, such as the Israeli state, the Palestinian Authority, and of course, the United Nations, the role of the Arab monarchies, things of that nature. We need to develop an understanding of that. Matthew has raised, again, as I did in my opening contribution, this issue of Israel's support for Hamas when it suited them at a certain stage. And I used the other illustration myself of Afghanistan. And it's important to keep raising that. And the direct role of American military, the American military, in the attacks needs to be raised. I must say, though, I don't think it's useful to speculate about the events on October the 7th. We don't know the detail of what happened. We know enough to draw conclusions, but I don't think it's useful to get involved. I must say the formulation that they were breaking out of a prison, I don't think that's a useful presentation of the argument. It's not as if they were going around with duffel bags to go on a shopping trip into Tel Aviv or going on a hike up to Tel Aviv. That's why they came out. I mean, that's not the issue. Hamas have made clear that they are determined to kill Israeli Jews at whatever opportunity is presented. They conducted a campaign of bus bombings and suicide killings in Israeli cities long before October the 7th, because it's their stated policy to wipe out the state of Israel, and in the course of that action, to wipe out Jews where the opportunities present themselves. That's sufficient. What the numbers were that they killed, what the numbers were that the IDF killed, the lies that are always told in war situations, we don't know. So we shouldn't really get too involved in what happened. But we do know something that happened. We do know that the policy of Hamas is to kill Israeli citizens. We know that. And we also know that Hamas kidnapped innocent Israeli civilians, men, women, and children, and are still holding them, which is also a horror story for the people there. So that's all. We can't get too involved. I think there's other questions which came up which are difficult to resolve. Number one, well, I should mention the radicalization, actually. I agree with that point that a couple of comments have made, that the radicalization that has flown from the mobilizations about the war in Gaza have long-term beneficial repercussions for the left. It has radicalized a whole new section of the population, the youth, not just the youth, but the youth principally, and that's very important. Kieran mentioned about slogans. I'm not sure about slogans. Some of the slogans that are shouted here are just ridiculous. They're meaningless slogans. It's just noise. If you want noise on a demonstration, then get a band to lead the march. Shouting slogans that have no meaning is only going to confuse people. Slogans are important. I'm not against slogans in principle, but some of the stuff that's yelled out as slogans here are just meaningless. They don't tell anybody anything. The purpose of a slogan is, first of all, to keep the morale up, and also to influence people who are watching the demonstration to see what it represents. So we shouldn't get too involved in that. This issue which Steve raised is interesting about a federal solution of two states, one Israeli state and one Palestinian state within a single federation. Yeah, I mean, that's obviously progress if it were to be achieved. And I saw that advanced, I can't think who it was, but somebody advanced that argument here some time ago, and I thought it was an interesting presentation. The argument about the one state, two state seems to have become obsolete. The one state, the two-state solution, sorry, which projected the Palestinian state based on the West Bank and Gaza, a huge amount, Dominic mentioned 700,000 settlers, but a huge amount of the territory of the West Bank is in effect annexed to Israel. And I was in the West Bank and I saw all this stuff, the settlements. I mean, these are not just encampments on the side of the road. These are cities, some of them 50,000 with big shopping malls and streets and all the big franchises selling. These settlements contain factories and big administrative centers. We actually went in this trip I was on, we went into one of the settlements and took part in the discussion with the settlers, not to influence the settlers, but to learn more about what's actually happening up there. But so much land has been taken by the settlers, and they're taking land all the time off Palestinians in the West Bank, burning people out of their houses in order to increase the land area. So they talk about a two-state solution where that then becomes one state in Israel, the other. No, it's not up to us to decide that. That's a matter for the Israelis and for the Palestinians to decide. But it seems as if it might be obsolete. It's important to raise the question, the demands in relation to democracy, the right of the Palestinians to a state, the right of everybody in the state to have equal rights, irrespective of religion. That's important to advance things of that nature. And if that can be done on the basis of a single unified state where everybody, Jews, Arabs, everybody would have equal rights and equal recognition in the state, that would be a huge advance if it could be achieved. Likewise, if there were to be a federal resolution, that would be good. Something to bear in mind about Hamas, though, whether there's direct talks or not with Hamas, Hamas have no solution whatsoever. Hamas are actually an obstacle to the struggle to achieve a democratic resolution. Hamas came into existence after the First Intifada. The First Intifada was a mass movement, particularly of youth, on the streets demonstrating. Then Hamas turned it into a violent, the Second Intifada was along the lines that Hamas wanted, which is a violent and killing sprees against Jews. Hamas also broke the unity between in the Palestinian Authority. Now, I know the corruption and all that by the Palestinian Authority leadership, but nonetheless, the unity that existed in the unified authority between Gaza and West Bank has been broken. And there were a few attempts to repair that, which hasn't, none of them have been successful. The general discussion has been very useful, but only in the sense that it has highlighted questions that we need to discuss again. We need to look in more detail at what these organizations represent. We need to, there's a kind of a fear on the left to be critical of Hamas. So I've noticed myself in demonstrations here. I've come across all that stuff here. People trying to argue, well, they didn't really do this and didn't do that. We know what they are. We know what they represent. So we shouldn't get too involved in the details of it. And the Israelis, of course, can use that to their advantage in the attacks they're carrying out in Gaza. So we need to just focus on things that we can influence. The final point I want to make is if there's to be more discussions, we need to focus them a bit more, not on proposing solutions that nobody is going to follow. So if we come up with a solution to the problem of Israel, I mean, who's going to turn to the WIN meeting to find a resolution? So the reason we're having discussions of this nature is to help our own understanding of the issues, our own understanding of the various parties and organizations that are involved, so that we can influence people from Israel and from the West Bank and also from other countries as well. So the discussion is to clarify issues so that we can then influence other people with whom the decision will rest. So in the future discussions, we need maybe to put a bit more attention to that. There is a trade union federation in Palestine, the Palestine Trade Union Federation, and there's a union federation in Israel, Histadrut, which, as we know, is part of the whole Zionist structure. From the very outset, the Histadrut was opposed to Palestinian members, and they've always supported the Israeli government and the Israeli policy, the Zionist policy. But nonetheless, they've also had actions on class issues in Israel, even within that parameter of the Zionist idea, to have had demonstrations and to have made achievements in terms of government spending and social welfare. So even in the limited context of the Histadrut's action, it still is an important class movement. It's like the big demonstrations against Netanyahu's government has potential in terms of building an alternative left. And it's also, we should remember also, some quite progressive organizations were in Israel who were trying to influence events. I mean, when we were there, we met a few of them, like Breaking the Silence, which is the ex-soldiers who talk about their experiences. We met them. And B'Tselem, which is the Israeli Jewish organization that helps Palestinians. So there are progressive organizations. It's like in America, the what's it called? The Oakland-based group, the Campaign for Peace, the American. It's quite a sizable organization. Has some influence. So we can influence people of that nature. So once again, I want to thank the comrades for what I found to be a very interesting discussion and very stimulating. And we'll all go away from this discussion with more things to consider, because questions have been raised that we don't have the straight answers to. And I look forward to further discussions of this nature. And just to conclude on the point that I concluded at the beginning, the answer lies with working class unity. Difficult that is to achieve, that is the only way to do it. Working class unity between Israeli workers, Palestinian workers, Arab workers generally, Egyptian workers, all combining and working together. And with that question of unity, working class unity, we can then more seriously examine the issue of what the next stage is going to be and what our next demand would be in terms of the resolution of the problem. So thanks again, comrades, for a very interesting discussion and for some very stimulating ideas.
Yeah, many thanks, Finn. I know you've put in a lot of effort into preparing and also in responding to points in discussion. The primacy of politics is, of course, what that's our bread and butter, a full meal. Just to illustrate from South Africa, the various radical groups have put their entire trust in the ANC government, which makes all kinds of statements about breaking diplomatic links with Israel and so forth. And the very next day says they'll never do that. In other words, we're finding new forms of Bonapartism which enter right into our politics, into the labor movement, because the labor movement in South Africa is totally confused on the issue, because it hands over all power to the ANC to make policy, on the issues. And without the working class being educated, which is what we're doing, to be able to understand the actual power relations and the real politics, what actually is taking place, as opposed to the headlines, which can confuse. Now, comrades, I think this is our last discussion for the year, and we should end on a triumphal note. If Roger was available, he would tell us how many meetings we've had, how many countries have participated, how many individual discussions or presentations there have been, et cetera, et cetera. We've done reasonably well, to use a bit of an English understatement. We've done very well. We've had a huge influx at times. We've had marvelous discussions on worker education, on the politics of Northern Ireland, of Ireland, of the nature of trade unions, of the conditions of struggle in Belarus and elsewhere, of the radicalization in America. We've done a huge range, and I think we're going to continue this very good tradition of having an open door to allow people of all persuasions in the labor movement to have a voice and to be able to understand and to gain a real political education. And I think this is a real gain that we've had, and we're very pleased to have the comrades of the ISP participating, but also comrades from all sides of the universe to be able to have a say, even those who are treading midnight by the time they say farewell. So I want to thank those comrades who are absent now, but from India, who I think have found that they've either fallen asleep at 11 o'clock or so, and who would have otherwise continued right to the end. Pam, I don't know if you want to sum up any other further statement, or we just advise comrades to look for their emails and the other notices that we'll make about future discussions in the new year.
Well, it's worth mentioning the next meeting will be the 7th of January. We're expecting to be talking about the Belton Road, 10th anniversary of the Belton Road. Is that correct, David?
That's correct, yeah.
Patrick Bond, aren't you? Yeah, so that'll be the next meeting. You'll get an email in due course.
Right. Comrades, I think that'll be a very useful discussion. As we know, Chinese capital is moving at the speed of light across Africa, Latin America, the rest of Asia, and so forth, with a regime of gross exploitation and so forth. At the moment, it has a cover because it's called communist, but it's extracting profit and it's extracting raw materials from Africa in particular. And I think the Namibian comrades would like to come in on their personal experience of the victimization at the hands of the Chinese corporate communist leaders, particularly who are there in the state-owned corporations and so forth. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it is that Belt and Road was meant to break China into all kinds of permanent relations with various states in these regions. And now it's come somewhat unstuck, and it's finding itself somewhat like the IMF. So to get a full understanding of it, we have an expert, Patrick Bond, who will be coming in and giving many a fact and many interpretation. Comrades, let's end on a high note. from South Africa, Amandla. That is all power to the working
Amandla.
class. And we should be singing ourselves out with the international. Anyway, farewell, comrades. Have a good break, and we look forward to you refreshed and full of ideas and enthusiasm. Thank you.